This is Power BI and more from CRM Audio with your host Ulrik Carlson. This episode is brought to you by CRM. The Dynamics 365 user group is the world's most influential user group community of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM users and partners. Across the globe, members have a common goal of maximizing and advancing the performance of Microsoft Dynamics 365 so that individuals and companies can improve operations, overcome obstacles, and exceed goals. We thank Dynamics 365 User Group for sponsoring Power BI and more from CRM Audio. Ulrik, we had a August release for Power BI. Got some nice goodies. What's in the goodie bag?
Oh, there's quite a few goodie bags, and we can start with one that's probably one of the simpler ones, but something people's really been asking for. So, any guesses? What would be a really simple thing that you usually can't do, but would be really, really nice to have?
I'm not sure. What is it?
Exporting to PDF.
Woohoo!
You see a great report, you're saying, this is great, I want to PDF that and send it to whoever I want to send it in my via email or whatever, print it out, etc. So finally, one button and you can export all your Power BI reports, etc. to a PDF document.
You could always print your dashboard or report to PDF. What's different about exporting to PDF versus just printing to PDF?
So when you were printing it, it was using the print format. So now it's basically designed to give you a nice looking PDF document with the reports in there. So everything is optimized for the PDF. You could say for a long time we also had the export to PowerPoint, which I thought was a nice feature. That's actually the one that I in the past have used the most. When I was generating reports and you would have to go into corporate meetings, annual meetings, etc., you would have to put all of your visuals in a PowerPoint. And back in the day, that was a lot of cut and pasting into PowerPoint, and you would just generate the PowerPoint there with all the visuals. And now you can do the same thing for the PDF and pass it on.
So let me ask you a question. I remember back in the day I used to write a lot of SSRS reports. PDF export was always a big headache because if you didn't get lined up just right or the right width, it would put in blank pages. Does this work more elegantly than that? Does it shrink it down to one page wide? How does that work, do you know?
So the few things I've been playing around with, it looks nice. There are some upper limitations if you have very long reports. I've heard some complaints about that, but otherwise it's a welcome feature. And as always, this is the first edition, right? So there might be some refinements over time.
Right. So I'm thinking, some people like PDF because it's easy to email, and if you have an old school boss that wants to get an email on a PDF, that's a good thing to do. Also, things you maybe will send somebody an output. People like PDF because it's kind of like the electronic document standard. It also can be locked so people can't edit it. As opposed to a Word document. A lot of reasons for that. People also sometimes like to use it to snapshot things, take an export of their report and save it so they can put it side by side with the one from last month and see how the pipeline has changed since then or something.
Right. Exactly. So it's a nice feature and it's something people have been asking a lot for. Of course, if this is a part of an ongoing conversation and the people you want to send that report to is internally, of course I want to have the conversation and say, wouldn't it be better that you share the report or send a link or subscribe to the report so you get a daily email digest basically of the information that's in your report, as opposed to sending around PDF documents. But when it comes to like getting a document and sending it externally, and as you mentioned, you can't make changes to the report. This is a great feature, and it definitely speeds up a lot of those processes. All right, another feature, and just to sum up on one of the features we were talking about last time, on how you could now conditionally color code your data in Power BI based on a value in the data set. And in our case for Dynamics 365, meaning that you could take your option sets, color codes import them into Power BI, and then use the same color codes throughout your Power BI reports that are also being used inside Dynamics 365 to create the consistency. One challenge with the Power BI reports there is that if you have a matrix, you are changing the background colors on some of the lines. The text that goes on top of it is can be difficult to read sometimes. So if you have a dark text and suddenly you have dark colors as the background, that can be very difficult to read, and vice versa. So there's actually some tricks out. Svg posted a blog post on how to conditionally format both options so you can get a good match between the font color and the background color. So that was Daniel. I'm hoping I'm saying his name right, that put a blog post out on that, which I think is good to have handy based on how these features can be used in the future for Dynamics 365. So we'll include a link in the podcast text for that.
So was conditionally formatting what, option sets?
Yes. So using the color codes from the option sets to conditionally format your Power BI visuals and your matrix. So when you have a line of cases, for example, and you color code them based on the priority or the value of the opportunity, etc., make sure that everything is still easy to read, even though you may have a mix of light and dark colors on the background of the line, for example.
Okay.
Sure, don't run into having a black background with black text on top of it, and nobody can see what the text is.
All right, send me a link to that so I can put it in the show notes.
Absolutely. And another feature that came out here, which isn't this directly related to Power BI, but I think was interesting to see what we can do with it in the future. There's a new tool out, and I'm having a really hard time pronouncing it. It is called the Charticulator.
Charticulator.
Yes. Did that sound like a combination of chart and articulate?
Yeah, something like that.
As a tool that is now available, and actually it's at charticulator.com. It's from Microsoft, and it's currently in preview, but what it does is that it allows you to create new visuals. You import some sample data, and you can basically play around with the tool and try and create new visuals, and it can do all kinds of visuals way beyond like your standard column and bar charts, but also do pie charts with additional information, various combinations, and what you can do and play around with it. And eventually, once you're happy with the visual that you've created, you can export it, or will be able to export it as a Power BI custom visual. So when you're trying it out right now, you can save the online version and play around with it. But if you look at the video that Microsoft provided to go with it, there is a export to Power BI option coming. So when it comes to creating custom visuals for Power BI, if you need something very specific that's not available, then you'll be able to try it out with the Charticulator first and see if you can create the visual that you need, as opposed to looking through the custom visuals, or potentially hiring somebody who could develop a custom visual from scratch. So that tool is definitely worth trying out. So, and I'm gonna attempt to create a chart in there. Very difficult one. It would be a column chart, stack column chart, with where you have both the values of the individual stacked items as well as a total on top.
Okay.
All right.
So what's the use case for? No. What's the use case for the Charticulator? When would you use that versus just the standard charts?
So whenever you have something that is more detailed than you want to create, you want to move the individual text items around. You want to change some color options in there, but it gives you a very refined control on where the text and the chart components are placed on the visual itself, including information about like the gap between the columns, etc. So it gives you the ability to really customize the layout of the chart itself. So in case you were an ISV, for example, you could have your own visual layout of some of your components. So when somebody's using Power BI and can use these visuals, they can clearly see what was created by the solution itself versus what they may have created themselves too. So it's kind of to give people a tool to get started on working with creating custom visuals and getting more custom visuals used in Power BI.
Okay, so the custom visuals, are those things that you can create without the Charticulator, or is it just making it easier to create the custom visuals?
Yeah, it's to make it easier to create them. Otherwise, it's something that would be developed and would require some developing skills. So this is an entirely visual editor where with your sample data, you can basically sit and drag around on the screen and change the settings and basically try out some different options and work towards your final result of how you want your chart to look like.
So do you think it's, I mean, is it powerful enough for most people, or will people still want to be going into the into code to create these if they really want to do it?
So that's going to be a good question. So based on the demos and what I've been kind of playing around with myself, there are some scenarios where you will be able to create something that's very specific. However, when you look at the videos, those visuals that they're creating with the tools are already custom visuals that are available in Power BI. So you can kind of see how they got to that result when working with it, or how you would create some of those charts. That being said, the custom visuals store or marketplace in Power BI is increasing all the time. So there's already a lot of custom visuals available from various providers that put them in there, including a lot of what Microsoft are creating. And they actually have a Power BI certified option now, so you can actually see what some of the visuals have been certified to work with Power BI versus some that are more, should we say, call them community-based, released, which may not live up to all the standard requirements of getting the Power BI custom visual certification. Okay,
so having nice tools to use, just like your chart editor, is a good thing.
Right, exactly. And the reason I was bringing up the stacked column chart with both the individual values as well as a total value for each column is that is actually something you cannot do in Power BI. All the stacked column charts will only display you in the individual values, not necessarily the total for each column. And that is actually the exact same issue in Dynamics 365 with the built-in charts there. Whenever you create a stacked column chart, you get the individual values, you don't get the total. And I always thought it was interesting that I thought that was like a fairly simple thing to put on, not the technique of doing it, but it's a fairly simple request to say, can I just get a total on top of this stacked column chart? But it was actually fairly complex to go through. You couldn't do that in Dynamics 365 either, and that had actually turned out to be, I think, my all-time most popular blog post was basically adding a total to a stacked column chart in Dynamics 365. And
I remember
ever since
you
I
had
first wrote it.
I remember you had a post about that. Sure.
Right, and it's about 4 years old, and it's still probably the one that gets the most traction. And I can see that's what people type in when they find it. And interestingly, the visuals in Power BI have the same limitation. So when I saw this, I was thinking one day I have some time, I'm gonna see if I can actually create that stacked column chart with a total on top, and have that in Power BI as well. Because the questions are starting to come in, like, okay, that's fine, but how do we then do it in Power BI?
Yeah, that's great.
All right. So on Power BI, want to note that there are some new workspaces coming for all the Power BI Pro users, and I just want to highlight this because that means that some of the old organizational content packs and the old workspaces will eventually disappear. That's something that's kind of been alluded to for a while, but now it seems like it's more definite that these old organizational content packs and workspaces will go away. So if you are in a situation where you want to use workspaces, you definitely want to enable the preview of the new workspaces and start creating those moving forward, so you won't have to upgrade or replace them in the future with the new version. The new workspaces does have some additional features which are going to be nice. The old type of workspaces basically only allowed you to add individual users. So you had to basically sit and add each individual user for each workspace, whereas the new version allows you to use security groups. It allows you to use Office 365 groups, the new modern groups as well. You're also going to be able to use distribution lists, so you don't have to like maintain your workspace list of users for your Power BI workspace separately. If you have an Office group, you have a distribution list, you just make sure you keep that one thing up to date, and then it's going to be handled through that. You're also getting some additional options on what kind of actions people can take with your report. Are they going to be co-admins? Are they going to be members? Can they be contributors and share more information with other users? Or maybe they'll just be a viewer, so they can only read the information on there. That last item is not available here in the preview. That'll come once it's generally available. So that's going to be some nice features there, and I mention it because if you are looking into workspaces and want to use those for sharing your Power BI reports, make sure you enable the preview and use the new version. Otherwise, you're just going to be updating it in a couple of months again.
Okay. How many people do you think use workspaces?
So right now, that's a good question. For enterprise customers, it is definitely being used a lot. It is a good way to share the reports or share a number of reports as opposed to sharing each report individually or each dashboard individually. So they've been very much used there. Smaller organizations, at least what I've seen, haven't used them as much because they've been creating their reports and dashboards, and they've pretty much been sharing the whole thing. I have had a smaller set of dashboards that they were sharing. But in large organizations, they've been used because that's how you would work with sharing the data and the reports, sharing the data between groups.
Right. It's bigger companies, enterprise companies that have a lot of different audiences within internally.
Right. And you can tell by some of the requirements and what you can do with it that the enterprise have had a lot to say in how Microsoft has set it up and added built in the requirements.
Okay, well, that's exciting. So it doesn't sound like there's anything to, I know I was going to say, anything to write home to mom about here, anything really exciting, but it's little incremental improvements, and that's the nice thing about having a monthly release is you don't have to have the big wow, but every month things come out, and then over time you look back and say, wow, we've come a long way in the past 6 months.
I know. Yeah, exactly. And one of maybe this might be a bigger thing, but support for Svg Images was recently added to Power BI. Microsoft
is all in on SVG.
So, and as you know, the new UI uses Svg Images in a lot of places too. So I was looking at how you could use those Svg images, because you basically need like the whole content of the file inside the Power BI report, and then you can display it in your matrix visuals or in your visuals in Power BI using those visuals. And Power BI also lets you retrieve information about visuals. So if you have a folder full of SVG icons, you can basically import that folder into your data model and use all of those smaller icons as a part of your Power BI reports. And the same way I was talking about the conditional formatting, you can build in those features in your SVG images. So, depending on various settings, you can change the color conditionally of those different images. So one thing I was thinking here, which might be fun looking into from a Dynamics 365 perspective, is could we then potentially connect Power BI to the Dynamics 365 and retrieve the information on all the SVG images that are available in there, and then use the standard Dynamics 365 icons as a part of your Power BI report too.
That's a really interesting scenario, and I'm thinking back to some SSRS reports we wrote that actually figured out how to get the icon from the entity and use that, and probably was borderline unsupported, if not totally unsupported. But that's a good thing if you have this one icon that you recognize as basically your project icon, and you got that same one in your report, that creates a consistency in UI, and some users really like that.
Right. Exactly, and that means that you could also, again, be using the conditional formatting on the colors with the various opportunities based on the values, etc. You can do a lot of nice editing there to have that very consistent experience between your Power BI report and Dynamics 365. So that's definitely something I want to look into. I kind of been looking up the web resources where those SVG icons are located and seeing if we can actually retrieve those via fetch XML, which we can. So it should be possible to get them into Power BI too and start using them in your reports.
Nice.
So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to try out. So whenever I have a couple hours available somewhere, that's what I'm going to be working on. I think I say that a lot on this podcast.
Yeah, that 20 minutes you have when you're not doing anything else.
Right.
It never comes.
Right. Exactly. Then we had this came out here in the August release, so these are a couple of weeks old, but there were two interesting that happened with the last desktop application. We got support for many-to-many relationships in Power BI, and we also got access to composite models.
So if you had a many-to-many relationship before and you needed to report on it, how did you do it without this?
Well, and that's why I was kind of going through it from a Dynamics 365 perspective here on this, because what we did with our Dynamics data, when we had opportunities to competitors, we would retrieve the intersect table into Power BI and basically use that as the bridge table, or the as it's sometimes called, to do the reporting on. So, and that would be our, if you will, manual many-to-many relationship options. So my first thinking here was, that's great, we can use that instead in this context, but the data is not going to align. If you have a list of opportunities and a list of competitors, you're not going to be able to align them in Power BI with a many-to-many relationship. You're still going to need that intersect table that has all the data on there. However, if you do have true many-to-many relationships, so that would be if you also had external data coming into the system, because I don't think you would ever use this if you had exclusively Dynamics 365 data, you shouldn't really need the many-to-many relationships. I think that would be like a fringe scenario if that came up. So don't be misled necessarily by the many-to-many relationships options. For Dynamics purposes, we would still want to get the intersect table into the Power BI data model and create it that way.
Okay, so if you're just focused on Dynamics, you can ignore the many-to-many. It's where you have data from multiple sources coming together that just makes your life easier. Does it create that intersect type view for you? What does it do?
So it basically mashes up the data based on the information you have. So if you have a key that's represented multiple times in both tables in the relationship, it's going to be a many-to-many relationship. Now, that's something you generally want to be careful of in data modeling. So unless you know exactly what you're doing and this is what you need, you are probably better off having a data model that only has one-to-many and many-to-one relationships if possible. But it's adding to the mix of what's in there. And I want to highlight it there because that many-to-many relationship there is different from how we talk about many-to-many relationships in Dynamics, where we essentially have that middle intersect entity. We just don't see it in the interface inside Dynamics. The other part of it, and many-to-many relationships are used in this context, is that we now have access to composite models. And in this context, that means that usually when we pull information into Power BI, we import the data. So you have all the data in your Power BI file online, and all your Dynamics data, we do the reporting on it. Your other option that we talked about a few times, especially in context of the data export service, is that you can also do a direct query. So instead of reading and modeling off the data that you have inside Power BI, you are actually reading directly off the source. that is only available on some data sources. One of those data sources is the Azure SQL database. So that's where the data export service come in. So if you have the data export service set up, you can do a direct query to your Dynamics data on your Azure SQL database, meaning that you can actually have Power BI reports that are as live as your SQL database there, which means that they are usually about, between a minute, probably a minute behind the actual database. I think it was like 95% of the data has been updated within 2 minutes. So you can actually get very close to live Power BI reports on your Dynamics 365 data using the direct query option. One of the challenges though there was that Power BI reports had to be either or. It either had to be import or it had to be direct query. And the direct query option has some limitations in terms of what you can do with the data. For example, you cannot add more columns to your data source. You cannot, for example, you couldn't create an additional URL column. There was a number of advanced KPIs and DAX formulas you couldn't do with it, but you were looking at live data and you were not limited by the size of the Power BI report. So Power BI had, the 1 GB limit on the file size. You could actually do a direct query on much, much larger data sets. What you can do with a composite model is that now you can actually have your, for example, your transactional data like opportunities, etc., activities as a direct query and mix it with your other Dynamics 365 data on, for example, accounts and contacts, etc., that are being updated, say, once an hour instead. So you can have those quick updates of the data and mix it in your report and basically get the most up-to-date KPIs as possible, and still retain some of the KPIs and features that you didn't have with a direct query only option.
Okay, so it's improving on it, so you don't have that delay you currently have. So when you really, really, really need real-time reports.
Right.
Okay.
Within at least within a few minutes, right? And a part of it is for the user experience, because you can say, do you really need that report here within an update report within the next minute, or is it okay that that it's updated at the top of the hour whenever Power BI reports next? From a practical perspective, it's probably just fine that it updates at the top of the hour. But if you're a salesperson or service rep, etc., and you just closed a big opportunity and you marked it as 1, you want to be able to go look at your monthly report or whatever and see the results with the new information included. Yeah, is it going to be the same results if you waited half an hour till Power BI updated? Yes, but from a user experience, you just want to see it right away. It's like those things where it's you do it for the user experience. You don't necessarily do it because you need the data. It's going to be way more satisfying.
Is there an extra cost for that, or is there any overhead in doing it that way?
So the only additional cost is the cost of the source, the Azure SQL database. So if we're looking at our setup with Dynamics 365, the data export service and the SQL database, and then of course a Power BI Pro license, this is a Pro feature. So you will have to invest in the Power BI Pro reports. The scenarios we were talking about, you would have to invest in Pro anyway, because it implied sharing those reports with other users and so on, so they can see them. But yeah, you will need Power BI Pro, and you will need to pay for the Azure SQL database as the source. The database itself, though, is fairly inexpensive in comparison to other costs of Dynamics 365.
So is the only potential downside having an additional cost for the Azure storage, or is there anything else that you lose in using this option?
With the composite model or using direct query?
Yeah, I guess either one.
So because with direct query, you do lose a number of features on what you can do with the data and how you can transform the data into your Power BI report. So you definitely lose something there. That is now going to be alleviated by the composite model, because you can basically mix the data between the two. So you can do those things that you otherwise couldn't do with your direct query data. You do it on the part of the data that you import into Power BI, and then the data that needs to be as live as possible, you can pull into Power BI in a fairly pure form and present it that way. So we're kind of talking about minimizing the gap between the direct query features the limitations for using direct query versus having a standard Power BI import.
Okay. Options are good, right?
Right. Exactly. And of course, you still want to think through on security, because with direct query, of course, people do need read access to the database that it's pulling the data from. And also, it's interesting, when you set up Power BI and you set up a direct query to an Azure SQL database, you can actually set up as a checkbox, and it says something like use authenticated users access for this data source. So that actually means that if I create a Power BI report that's direct query, and I send it to you, and you log into that report and look at it, or I share that report with you, and you look at it online, still my report, but you look at it online in context with your login. That actually means it's going to pass your login to the source in the Azure SQL database and only show you the data that you have access to. And at first I thought, whoa, does this help us with a lot of the security challenges that we've been talking about between Dynamics and Power BI? And it's kind of a trick question, because it doesn't, because your security in Dynamics is not related at all to your security access to the Azure SQL database. So we're still in the same scenario that we talked about previously on how do you handle security with your Power BI data, Dynamics data in Power BI.
How is this different from using the Azure SQL database for the Dynamics export service?
Oh, that's the same thing. That is, when you connect to it, you have the option of how do you want other users to connect. Usually when you set up your Power BI report, everything is imported in the name of the person who created the report. So if I create a report and I'm the system admin and I download everything, I have access to it, and I share that report, then everybody else that can see my report sees it through my credentials, basically. But with direct query, you can actually, there's a setting where you do the direct query, and that data is not through the report owner's credentials. It will be through the report viewer's credentials. So those will be the credentials that are passed on to the source and looks at all the data. The only challenge is that the source in this case is not Dynamics 365. It's the Azure SQL database, which doesn't have all those security settings that we have inside Dynamics.
Right.
So I mentioned it because that checkbox, when you set it up, can look a little misleading. At first you're like, oh, great, that's perfect. That's what we've been looking for. But actually, if you go back and listen to our security podcast, this security session that we did where we talked about the Power BI and Dynamics 365 security, all the methodologies and the tips and tricks we're talking about can all be used for both Dynamics 365 and the Azure SQL database, or when using the data export service. So actually all the information about retrieving your security settings and the POA table and so on, those are all tables that you can make a part of the data export service and make a part of your data model in the SQL database. So what you could do inside Dynamics with the data in Power BI, you can also do from the data export service.
Got it. Okay. That's good to know.
So you just got to make, well, those are all system entities, so they're already enabled for change tracking, but otherwise the trick will be to enable them for change tracking and then just add them to your data export service model. All right, and I think that's what we have for the August release. As you know, we're still waiting excitedly for the October release so we can get our hands on some of the new Power BI embedded in Dynamics out-of-the-box features, and really see what's that even going to look like, and how we can use it to our advantage.
Yeah, that'll be good. And hopefully over the next couple weeks, we'll be seeing more detail. And before then, we'll have previews and all that. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff we're looking forward to. But, yeah, this is enough to hold us over, I guess, with new features in Power BI.
Right. And at some point, we're also going to have to see how are we going to upgrade all of our old chart customizations into the new UI. So that's an area too where we don't have too much clarity on exactly what we're going to do, but as we find out, we'll definitely discuss that as well.
That'll give us something to talk about next episode.
Right.
All right. Thanks, Ulrik.
All right. Thanks, Joel.